at 20,000 feet above a burning continent, where the sky turned thin and white, and every breath felt borrowed. A 19-year-old boy sat alone inside a bubble of glass and steel, his back pressed against twin .50 caliber machine guns, his boots braced against frozen metal, his world reduced to a narrow arc of sky behind him. He was the last line of defense for a 10-man crew flying inside a B-17 flying fortress, and when enemy fighters appeared out of the sun like dark birds of prey, it was his job to see them first, to fire first, and to die first if anything went wrong. Because in the tail of that bomber, isolated, unheated, barely armored, there was no glory, only terror measured in seconds and tracer fire. And the brutal truth was this: the tail gunner was both the eyes of the fortress and the most exposed soul aboard it. The missions began before dawn in the damp airfields of eastern England, where fog clung to the runways and the ground crews worked under dim lights, loading bombs into the belly of the aircraft while the crew gathered for briefing, coffee trembling in tin cups as maps were unrolled and red threads stretched across Europe toward targets deep inside Germany. They would be told about flak concentrations, about expected fighter opposition from squadrons flying aircraft like the Messerschmitt, Bf-109 or the Focke-Wulf Fu-190, about weather fronts over the North Sea, and the tail gunner would listen carefully, because he knew something others didn't fully grasp. The attack almost always came from behind. Climbing into the B-17 was like entering a steel cathedral built for war. Narrow catwalks and cables, running along the fuselage, the smell of oil and cold metal everywhere. But the tail section was a different world entirely. To reach it, the gunner crawled past the waist gunners, squeezing through the narrowing fuselage, until he reached the small compartment at the very end, a cramped turret enclosed in plexiglass that gave him a 360-degree view of death. And once he was strapped in, knees bent, shoulders hunched, he could barely move, because there was no room to stand, no room to stretch, no room to escape. When the engines roared to life and the bomber rolled down the runway, the vibrations traveled through the airframe into his bones, and as the aircraft climbed higher and higher, past 10,000 feet, then 15, then 20, the temperature inside the tail dropped to levels that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, even with electrically heated suits, gloves, and boots. Frost formed along the inside of the plexiglass, and the gunner's breath crystallized in the air, and sometimes the heating systems failed, turning that tiny compartment into an icebox, where fingers went numb and machine guns jammed from the cold. Yet cold was only the beginning. As the bomber formation crossed the North Sea and entered enemy airspace, black puffs of anti-aircraft fire began appearing in the distance. Flak bursts from German batteries below, and the sky would fill with explosions that rocked the aircraft, metal fragments tearing through aluminum skin. The tail gunner could see it all from his lonely perch, watching other bombers in the formation stagger when hit, watching parachutes bloom like tragic flowers against the gray sky, and sometimes watching a fortress break apart in midair, wings shearing off as men were thrown into nothingness. But flak was blind and random, fighters were deliberate. The first sign was often a glint, sunlight flashing off a canopy or wing, far behind the formation, and the tail gunner's heart would spike, because he knew that a coordinated attack from enemy interceptors could shred a bomber in seconds. He would shout into his intercom, voice cracking with static, calling out positions. Fighters at 6 o'clock low, while swiveling his twin Brownings toward the incoming shapes, calculating lead, distance, speed, praying his guns would not jam, because if they did, there was no one else covering directly behind them. German pilots understood the weakness of the tail. Attacking from dead astern minimized exposure to other defensive guns. An aircraft like the Messerschmitt, Bf-110 sometimes carried heavy cannons, designed to punch through bomber armor with devastating effect, and when those cannons fired, the shells could rip straight through the tail assembly, snapping control cables, or killing the gunner instantly. There were missions where tail sections were blown clean off, the rear compartment tumbling away from the rest of the plane like a broken toy. The gunner still strapped inside that glass bubble. Time distorted. Attacks that lasted seconds felt like minutes. The roar of engines blending with the hammering recoil of machine guns. Brass casings clattering around his boots as he fired burst after burst. Watching tracers arc toward the enemy, sometimes seeing a fighter erupt into smoke and flame, sometimes seeing it press on regardless, guns flashing, bullets striking the plexiglass inches from his face. He could not look away. He could not duck. He could not run. If the bomber went down, escape for the tail gunner was far more difficult than for the rest of the crew. To bail out, he had to rotate his guns aside, unstrap himself, crawl forward through the fuselage, possibly past fire, smoke, or structural damage, retrieve his parachute, and jump through a narrow hatch. All while the aircraft might be spinning out of control. Many never made it, trapped by twisted metal or killed before they could move. And in some cases, crews had to physically pull the tail gunner forward if he was wounded, dragging him through the narrow passage while the aircraft burned around them. Despite this, tail gunners developed a reputation for sharp eyes and steady nerves. They were often among the youngest on the crew, chosen for their agility and eyesight, and they carried a psychological burden unique to their position. Because they saw the enemy first and often saw their friends die in other aircraft before anyone else did, the view from the tail was panoramic and merciless. There were missions over cities, like Berlin, where the sky became a battlefield so crowded with bombers, fighters, and flak that it resembled a storm of steel. The tail gunner watched contrails twist and intersect, watched fighters weave between formations, and sometimes watched parachutes drift down over hostile territory, knowing that capture awaited those who survived the fall. And through it all, he remained in his glass coffin, scanning the horizon, because the next attack could come at any second. The propaganda films called the B-17 a flying fortress, invulnerable and bristling with guns. But the men in the tail knew better. They knew that aluminum skin was thin, that a single well-placed cannon shell could end everything, that frostbite and oxygen deprivation were constant threats, and that the so-called fortress relied not on magic armor, but on formation flying and mutual defense. If a bomber strayed from the group, it became a lone, bleeding target, and the tail gunner's job grew exponentially more dangerous. And still they climbed into that cramped compartment mission after mission, counting toward the magic number. 25 sorties, later increased to 30 and beyond. That meant they could go home. Many never reached it, because in the end, the brutal reality of the B-17 tail gunner was this. He sat alone at the very edge of the aircraft, staring into the abyss of European skies, knowing that if death came, it would likely come from directly behind, fast and without warning, and yet he kept his eyes open, his guns ready, and his voice steady over the intercom, guarding the lives of 9 other men who trusted him to see what they could not. And when the bomb bay doors opened, and the payload dropped toward factories, rail yards, and cities below, the tail gunner was still looking backward, not forward, because survival did not depend on the target. It depended on what was chasing them home. At altitude, isolation becomes something physical, something that presses against the ribs and hums inside the skull. And for the tail gunner of a B-17 flying fortress, that isolation was absolute, because while the rest of the crew operated in pairs or small clusters, the pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, the navigator and bombardier in the nose, the waist gunners side by side amidships, the boy in the tail sat utterly alone, separated by yards of fuselage and roaring engines, dependent on a thin wire of intercom static to remind him that 9 other hearts beat somewhere ahead of him. He could hear them breathing, hear the clipped commands of the pilot, the calm voice of the bombardier counting down to release. But physically he was cut off, sealed in plexiglass, knees bent in a half, crouch that grew more painful by the hour. And when the bomber droned over enemy territory for 6, 7 sometimes 8 hours. The ache in his legs and the numbness in his fingers were constant companions. Psychologically, the position demanded a peculiar kind of courage. Not the charging bravado of a fighter ace, but a sustained vigilance that bordered on obsession. The tail gunner had to stare into emptiness for endless minutes, scanning the sky behind the formation, searching for a flicker of movement against clouds or contrails, because enemy pilots flying aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 had perfected the art of approach from blind spots, using the sun, the cloud layers, or the chaos of other bombers as cover before diving in, with cannons blazing. And the first hint of their presence might be nothing more than a dark speck, swelling rapidly into a machine of metal and fire. The formation itself was both shield and trap. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of B-17s flew in tight combat boxes, each bomber overlapping fields of fire with its neighbors, creating a lattice of defensive arcs that made head-on or beam attacks costly for interceptors. Yet the stern approach remained attractive to German pilots, because it minimized exposure time, and so the tail gunners bore the brunt of that strategy, bracing for the sight of fighters lined up at 6 o'clock, closing fast. When they came in coordinated waves, the sky behind the formation seemed alive with engines, and the gunner's voice would crackle through the intercom, urgent and precise, calling out altitude and direction, guiding the waist gunners to shift their aim, warning the pilot to tighten formation. Combat from the tail was intimate in a way that few other positions experienced. A head-on attack flashed past in seconds, but a stern chase could stretch agonizingly long, with an enemy fighter sitting directly behind, inching closer, firing bursts that stitched the fuselage with sparks. The tail gunner would squeeze his triggers in controlled bursts, feeling the vibration of twin .50 caliber Brownings, watching tracer rounds arc toward the enemy canopy, sometimes seeing the fighter veer off trailing smoke, sometimes seeing it absorb punishment and continue closing, its nose-mounted guns flaring. The plexiglass around him might spiderweb from impacts, and shards could slice through his gloves, and yet he had to keep firing, because if he faltered, the next burst might tear through control cables running along the tail, severing the bomber's ability to steer. Cold magnified everything. At operational altitudes, temperatures plunged to 40 or 50 degrees below zero, and despite electrically heated suits, failures were common, especially after flak fragments cut wiring. And when the heat went, the cold crept in fast, stiffening fingers until the gunner struggled to flex them around the triggers. Lubrication in machine guns thickened, increasing the risk of jamming at the worst possible moment, and clearing a jam in that cramped turret required dexterity that frostbitten hands could not easily provide. There were missions where tail gunners returned with blackened fingertips, skin cracked and bleeding, or worse, did not return at all because a jammed gun left them defenseless against a closing fighter. Oxygen was another invisible enemy, above 20,000 feet. Consciousness depended on the steady flow of oxygen through rubber masks, and a punctured line or frozen regulator could induce hypoxia within minutes, clouding judgment, slowing reaction times. Some gunners reported strange euphoria, a dreamy detachment as enemy fighters approached, an almost peaceful haze that had to be fought through with willpower, because losing focus even briefly could mean failing to spot an incoming attack. Others described splitting headaches and blurred vision, the edges of the world darkening while they tried to maintain their scan pattern, left to right, high to low, never lingering too long in one sector. When things went wrong in the tail, they went wrong catastrophically. Cannon fire from aircraft such as the Wolf-Waffen 190 could explode against the rear fuselage, and a single 20 mm shell detonating near the turret might shred the thin aluminum skin, sending fragments ricocheting inside the compartment. There were documented cases where tail gunners were killed instantly, their position destroyed in a flash, the rest of the crew unaware until silence replaced the expected callouts over the intercom. Sometimes the first sign was simply the absence of a voice that had always been there. Yet survival stories circulated as well, whispered in barracks and mess halls back in England. Tales of tail gunners who fought off multiple attackers, who stayed at their guns despite wounds, who watched enemy fighters spiral downward after well-placed bursts. Such stories were lifelines, proof that vigilance and courage could tip the balance. Even against experienced Luftwaffe pilots, one gunner described locking eyes, if only for a fraction of a second, with the pilot of an approaching fighter before firing. The human connection in that instant searing into memory long after the smoke cleared. The return leg of a mission was often the most deceptive phase. Bombs dropped, target receding behind them. Crews might feel a fragile relief, but fuel levels were lower, formations looser, and German interceptors sometimes struck hardest during withdrawal, catching bombers straggling over cities like Hamburg or over the industrial heartland of the Reich. The tail gunner, exhausted from hours of scanning, had to maintain the same intensity as at the start, because fatigue dulled senses, and a single missed speck on the horizon could spell disaster. It was on these long, draining legs that mistakes happened. Guns left unsafe, sectors neglected for a few seconds too long. Crossing back over the North Sea, weather could close in without warning. Icing conditions formed along wings and tail surfaces, adding weight and strain. And if the aircraft had taken damage earlier, control surfaces stiff, cables frayed, the tail gunner might feel unusual vibrations, subtle changes in how the bomber responded. He could sense, in the tremor of the fuselage beneath his boots, whether something was wrong, yet he had little ability to fix it. He was observer and defender, not mechanic or pilot, and so he reported what he felt, trusting those ahead to manage the crippled machine. Bailing out from the tail remained a nightmare scenario. Training drilled the sequence into muscle memory. Rotate guns, disconnect intercom, unclip harness, crawl forward. But reality often shattered neat procedures if the bomber entered a spin. Centrifugal force could pin the gunner against the side of the turret, making movement nearly impossible if fire erupted in the waist section. The narrow passage became a corridor of smoke and flame. Some crews made grim decisions, weighing seconds against survival odds. And there were moments when tail gunners understood that escape might not be possible. In those moments, some continued firing until the very end, covering their crew even as altitude bled away. The mythology of the flying fortress masked a stark truth: each mission was a gamble, and the tail gunner's odds were shaped by factors beyond his control: weather, enemy tactics, mechanical reliability. But within that uncertainty, his discipline mattered profoundly. Steady scanning, accurate callouts, controlled bursts instead of panic spraying. These habits could deter an attacker long enough for neighboring bombers to bring additional guns to bear, creating a crossfire that forced fighters to break off. In this way, the isolated boy in the tail influenced the survival of not just his own aircraft, but the integrity of the entire formation. As campaigns intensified over Europe and targets grew more heavily defended, casualty rates climbed. Replacements arrived, often younger and less experienced, climbing into the tail with wide eyes, absorbing lessons from veterans who had somehow survived a dozen missions. They learned to read contrails for patterns of movement, to distinguish friendly escorts from hostile silhouettes, to manage fear by narrowing focus to immediate tasks, because fear, unmanaged, could paralyze, and paralysis in the tail was lethal. When the wheels finally touched English soil and the engines wound down, the tail gunner unstrapped slowly, legs trembling from cold and tension, crawling forward into the relative warmth of the fuselage, greeted by crewmates with slaps on the back or silent nods. Sometimes he carried news no one wanted to hear: another bomber lost, a friend's parachute seen drifting down. Sometimes he carried the quiet pride of having driven off attackers, but always he carried the memory of staring into the void at 6 o'clock, knowing that the next mission would demand the same relentless vigilance. And as he walked across the hardstand, frost still clinging to his gear. He understood something civilians back home never could, that in the vast machinery of strategic bombing, in the grand maps and arrows and speeches about turning points and production targets, survival often hinged on a solitary figure in a glass turret at the very rear of a bomber, watching the sky behind and refusing, no matter how cold or afraid, to look away. As the engines of the B-17 Flying Fortress fade into the gray English sky, the world below returns to silence. But for the tail gunner, the war never truly ends. He was the last man in the aircraft, the first to see death coming, the one who stared directly into the enemy's guns. No cockpit glory, no bomb release spotlight, just frozen air shaking metal, and fighters screaming in from 6 o'clock. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Foch, Wolfdell 190 weren't just machines to him. They were shadows that haunted his view, shapes that decided whether he would see tomorrow. History remembers the strategy. It remembers the cities. It remembers the generals. But today we remember the boy in the glass coffin. Because inside that narrow tail turret, at 25,000 feet above places like Berlin, survival depended on one thing: courage under isolation. And that was the brutal reality of the B-17 tail gunner. Would you have had the courage to sit alone in the tail turret? Do you think the B-17 truly deserved the name Flying Fortress? Which WWII bomber role do you think was the most dangerous? Should we make a documentary on B-24 gunners next? If this story gave you chills, hit like so more people can learn what these young airmen endured. Comment below, 6 o'clock, if you watched till the end, and subscribe for more brutal, untold World War II aviation stories.